Derek Wilson stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the first light of morning filter through the Japanese maples he'd planted 3 years ago. His backyard had been the selling point of this modest suburban home, not particularly large by neighborhood standards, but thoughtfully designed to maximize both beauty and function. This sanctuary hadn't come easily. 7 years of apartment living, careful saving, and countless weekends of DIY landscaping had transformed the space into the perfect work-from-home environment for his boutique architectural practice. The privacy it afforded wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity for client calls, creative thinking, and the focused work his profession demanded. Derek sipped his coffee, mentally preparing for an important client presentation later that afternoon. But the sanctuary he had designed so carefully was about to face an unexpected intruder. Richard Barton, rich to everyone who received his embossed business cards, had moved into the adjacent property just 2 months ago. The house had sold for well above asking price, a fact Rich mentioned within the first 3 minutes of introducing himself over the fence. Tech industry, he'd explained with a practiced smile when Derek asked what he did. Built and sold 2 startups, now VP of Innovation at Quantum Solutions. The title had been delivered with the expectation of recognition, followed by a barely concealed flash of disappointment when Derek simply nodded politely. The first few weeks had been uneventful. Rich had a team of landscapers tearing out his backyard for what he described as a complete outdoor living space redesign. Derek had sympathized, remembering his own journey to create his backyard retreat. But then came the small boundary violations that grew increasingly difficult to ignore. It started with tools. Derek would come home to find his garden shears or pruners missing, only to spot them later on Rich's patio. When confronted, Rich was all easy smiles and casual dismissal. "Hope you don't mind, just needed them for a quick job." "We're neighbors, what's the big deal?" Derek had let it go, not wanting to seem petty. But it didn't stop there. By the 4th week, Rich had established a morning routine that involved bringing his coffee to sit by Derek's koi pond, often taking business calls that echoed through the otherwise quiet yard. Derek would look up from his desk in the office pod to find Rich pacing through his garden, talking loudly. When Derek finally worked up the courage to confront him again, Rich's response left him stunned. "Look man, your yard is just sitting empty most of the day while you're inside that glass box. Besides, my backyard is a disaster zone with the construction. I figured we could share the space, like a co-working arrangement." "This isn't a co-working space," Derek had replied firmly. "It's my private property, and I need the quiet for my work." Rich had looked at him as though he was being unreasonable. "You architects are also particular about space," he'd said with a laugh that contained no actual humor. "But sure, whatever, I'll try to keep it down." He hadn't kept it down. If anything, the intrusions increased. The breaking point came during an important video meeting with potential clients, a couple looking to build a sustainable home on a difficult hillside property. The contract would be Derek's biggest of the year, and he'd spent weeks preparing the presentation. He had set up in his outdoor office specifically to showcase how natural light and surroundings could be incorporated into a home design. The meeting was going exceptionally well. The clients were engaged, asking thoughtful questions as Derek walked them through his concept renderings. Then, over his shoulder, he watched their expressions change from interest to confusion. "Is someone else there with you?" the wife asked, peering at her screen. Derek turned to find Rich and a contractor walking through his garden, measuring tape extended between them, discussing loudly where a water feature might go. They were directly in the background of his video call, completely oblivious to the meeting they were disrupting. "Excuse me one moment," Derek said to his clients, muting his microphone and stepping outside. "Rich, I'm in the middle of an important client meeting," he said, struggling to keep his voice level. "You can't be here right now, or any time without permission." Rich looked up, momentarily surprised, then waved dismissively. "We'll just be a few more minutes. My contractor needs measurements for sightlines from my property." That's not the point. You're trespassing, and you're visible on my video call. Rich sighed dramatically. Fine, fine. We'll come back later. He rolled up his measuring tape with deliberate slowness. Your privacy obsession is a bit much, though. It's just a yard. By the time Derek returned to his meeting, the momentum was gone. The client seemed distracted, and their questions had taken on a hesitant quality. They ended the call, promising to think about it and get back to him. The kiss of death in client pitches. 1 week later, Derek returned from a coffee run to find 4 men in business suits seated in his meditation area. Rich stood before them with a tablet, gesturing enthusiastically at the koi pond. A small table had been set up with coffee and pastries, using Derek's outdoor dishware. For a moment, Derek stood frozen at his own garden gate, unable to process the audacity. Then a cold, calm clarity washed over him. He approached the group slowly, control in every step. Rich didn't notice him until he was almost upon them. "Oh, Derek?" Rich's smile was broad and unfazed. Perfect timing. "Gentlemen, this is my neighbor Derek, who designed this great space we're using for our meeting. Derek, these are some investors interested in my new venture." The men nodded politely, clearly assuming this had been arranged. "Everyone needs to leave," Derek said quietly. "Now." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. "We're almost done," Rich said with a strained laugh. "Just another 20 minutes. "This is private property," Derek continued in the same measured tone. "You have not been invited. You are trespassing." The businessmen began gathering their things, murmuring awkward apologies. Rich's smile had hardened into something ugly as he watched his meeting disintegrate. As the last investor hurried out the gate, Rich turned to Derek. "That was completely unnecessary. My yard's under construction, and this space sits empty most of the day anyway." Derek met his gaze without blinking. "This is the last time you'll trespass on my property. Consider yourself warned." Rich snorted. "Or what? You'll call the police over a neighborly misunderstanding? Grow up." He collected his tablet and followed his guests, leaving the coffee cups and food scattered across Derek's table. As Derek cleaned up the mess, his architect's mind was already formulating a solution. One that would use his professional expertise to solve a personal problem once and for all. But it wouldn't be a fence or a wall. No, Derek had something far more creative in mind. That evening, Derek called his college roommate Marcus, who had gone on to become a botanical specialist at the university's Agricultural Research Center. "I need plants," Derek explained after recounting his neighbor's situation. "Special ones." "Define special," Marcus replied cautiously. "Nothing illegal or permanently harmful, just something memorable. Something that will make him regret trespassing in my yard." 3 days later, Marcus arrived with a pickup truck loaded with potted plants, each labeled with scientific names and handling instructions. The men spent the weekend strategically integrating the new specimens into Derek's existing landscape. "This purple-flowered plant is catnip," Marcus explained. "But it's a special type my team created that's 3 times stronger than normal. When someone steps on it or crushes the leaves, it releases a terrible skunk-like smell." Next, he showed Derek some ordinary-looking patches of clover. "This is red clover. It's completely harmless to people, but honeybees absolutely love it. These special ones will keep flowering all season long, constantly attracting more and more bees." "These are devil's trumpets," Marcus said with a sly smile. "They have gorgeous white flowers that open up in the evening. They're totally safe unless someone eats them. But here's the best part. When someone bumps into them, they release a sticky pollen that smells like rotting meat. This awful smell sticks to clothes for days and almost never washes out completely." By Sunday evening, Derek's garden looked even more beautiful than before, with strategic pathways through the new plantings that would seem natural to anyone walking through. A few days after the new plantings, Derek's patience was rewarded. His phone pinged with a security alert. Motion detected in the back garden. The live feed showed Rich strolling confidently through the gate, coffee in hand, headed toward his usual spot by the koi pond. Derek watched from his kitchen window as Rich settled into the meditation area, surrounded by the now thriving devil's trumpet plants. Rich placed his coffee on a flat rock and spread out some documents, clearly preparing for another day of unauthorized co-working. The first sign that something was different came when Rich shifted position, accidentally brushing against one of the flowering shrubs. He wrinkled his nose, looking around in confusion. He sniffed his sleeve, then made a face of disgust. But apparently deciding it was a temporary odor, he returned to his papers. As the morning warmed, the clover patches began releasing their sweet scent. Within 30 minutes, the first exploratory bees arrived, buzzing gently among the blossoms. Rich seemed not to notice, absorbed in a phone call with his colleague. "Yes, absolutely, we're disrupting the entire sector," Rich was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Our back-end infrastructure is revolutionary." He swatted absently at a bee that had ventured too close to his face, interrupting his pitch. Then another bee appeared, and another. Derek watched as Rich's gestures became more animated, his pitch punctuated by increasingly frantic swats at the growing cloud of interested pollinators. "Everything's completely on schedule," Rich insisted into his phone, his voice rising in pitch as he stood up to move away from the bees. In his haste, he stumbled directly into a large patch of the triple-strength catnip. The plant's leaves crushed under his expensive loafers, instantly releasing a pungent, almost skunk-like odor. Rich jumped back, dropping his phone directly into the crushed plants. "Damn it!" he shouted, bending to retrieve the device and further disturbing the catnip. The odor intensified dramatically. By now, the bees from the clover had reorganized, forming a loose but persistent cloud around Rich's head. He began flailing his arms wildly, trying to disperse them, while simultaneously retrieving his phone and attempting to salvage his business call. "Everything's fine," he shouted into the phone, his voice cracking. "Just a small ow!" The first sting came from a bee that had become entangled in his carefully styled hair. Rich slapped at his head, crushing the bee and earning another sting on his palm in the process. Panicking now, Rich backed away from the clover patch and directly into one of the devil's trumpet bushes. The delicate flowers dumped their load of sticky, foul-smelling pollen all over his tailored shirt and pressed slacks. "I have to call you back," Rich yelled into the phone before disconnecting and making a mad dash for the garden gate. But his path took him through the remaining catnip patches, crushing more leaves and intensifying the clinging odor. The bee cloud, now thoroughly agitated by his frantic movements, pursued him all the way to the property line. From his kitchen window, Derek watched as Rich flailed his way back to his own yard, slapping at bees and frantically brushing at the yellowish pollen staining his clothes. Even from a distance, Derek could see angry red welts forming on Rich's neck and hands. The garden remained undisturbed for nearly a week. Derek had begun to wonder if Rich had finally learned his lesson when his security alert pinged again. This time, it wasn't Rich on the camera, but a woman Derek recognized as Rich's wife, Jennifer. She approached his front door cautiously, keeping a noticeable distance when Derek answered. "I want to apologize for my husband," she began without preamble, "and ask what you've done to your garden." "What do you mean?" Derek asked innocently. Jennifer sighed. "Rich came home last Tuesday, covered in bee stings and smelling like, I don't even know how to describe it. Dead skunk mixed with rotting flowers? We've had to throw out all the clothes he was wearing, and he's still breaking out in hives. He insists it's something in your garden." Derek maintained a neutral expression. "I've added some new plants recently, native species, very eco-friendly. Some people do have allergic reactions to certain pollens." "He said the bees chased him for 2 blocks, Jennifer continued. "And the smell, we had to cancel a dinner party because it was still clinging to his skin. He's been sleeping in the guest room." "That sounds uncomfortable," Derek offered diplomatically. "Though I will point out that if he hadn't been in my garden without permission, he wouldn't have encountered my new plants." Jennifer's expression shifted slightly. "So you did this on purpose?" "I planted legal, non-toxic plants on my private property," Derek clarified. "What happens to people who trespass isn't really my concern." She studied him for a moment, then unexpectedly smiled. You know, he wouldn't tell me why he was in your yard in the first place. Just kept saying it was a misunderstanding between neighbors. Is that what he calls using my garden as his personal outdoor office and hosting business meetings on my property without permission? That explains a lot, she murmured. He's been impossible to live with since moving here, constantly complaining about the construction delays in our yard. I had no idea he was invading your space. She gave Derek an appraising look. Those plants, they're not permanent, are they? The effects, I mean. The bee stings will heal in a few days. The smell should fade eventually. Though I've heard the devil's trumpet pollen can reactivate with sweat for up to 2 weeks. Sometimes, Derek reflected as he worked in his now peaceful garden office, the best solutions were the ones that let nature take its course. And if Rich occasionally caught a whiff of something unpleasant when the wind blew just right, well, boundaries were important lessons best learned thoroughly.